Good evening. Good evening, everyone. I'm Harold Holzer, and I have the honor of serving as director of the Roosevelt House Public Policy Institute, and on behalf of our president, Jennifer Rabb, who has made this amazing place a jewel in Hunter's Crown. It's a pleasure to welcome you all. Happy New Year. Welcome back. History is filled with stories of pretty remarkable people who bridge the private and public sectors, right? So here's a shorthand example. A wealthy man rejects the life of a country squire and man about town to focus on what he can do for others so they can stand a stronger chance in the race of life. That, in a nutshell, is the heroic story of the man who recovered from polio here and ran for governor and president using this house as one of his headquarters. And in this house, just a few floors above, I know you've heard Jennifer and me talk about this often, basically wove the strands that became the social safety net and created the New Deal in this shrine that we have the privilege of occupying and using for our students and the public. Well, that's one such story. There's another variation, a self-made billionaire who starts with little and creates a brand and makes a fortune, dominates an industry, conquers the media, and then suggests he can serve a wider public through politics and government service. There are a couple of such examples, right? One of them serving in the White House, one of them served as mayor of New York. The latter is the person we're here to revisit, re-examine, and reappraise this evening, Mike Bloomberg and his place in New York history and maybe the might-have-been realm of American history. I didn't tell our special guest this story, but I think I know what Mayor Bloomberg thinks his place in history is. At a reception marking the conclusion of his 3 terms as mayor, he came over to my table before a dinner began and said, "You're a historian. Who do you think is the greatest mayor in the history of New York?" It's true. And before I can answer, he said, "And what the hell did LaGuardia ever really do?" Well, at least he made it easier to do the ranking on the spot. But it's time for a serious look. And of course, Hunter's own Joe Vitariti, who is here tonight as well to lead the discussion that will follow when our special guest finishes his opening talk, began peeling away the layers of the historical onion with his own recent book about mayors from LaGuardia to de Blasio, including Mayor Bloomberg. I think it's fair to say, and President Rabb and I have both worked for and with mayors, that we learn so much from the historians who delve deeply into the eras that we sort of skirt above and get through day by day. So it's an honor and a pleasure, as always, to welcome Joe here, and it's a particular honor to welcome a new friend to Roosevelt House, Chris McNichol, author of Bloomberg, A Billionaire's Ambition, which was recently published to great acclaim, and will be available, I should always tell you, for signing after this evening's event. Chris will speak, and then Joe will reply, and then there'll be an opportunity for you to do a Q&A. As you know, and I should give the title of Joe's book because it too will be available for signing upstairs, is The Pragmatist, Bill de Blasio's Quest to Save the Soul of New York. Joe was the founding faculty chair of the Public Policy Department here at Roosevelt House, and of course he's in the Hunter Hall of Fame as an alum, a longtime teacher, and always a great observer of the political scene. I think we'll learn a great deal from Chris over the next hour. He is a lifelong New Yorker himself, though he went far afield, it seems, to earn his PhD in American history from the University of Chicago after earning his BA in economics and international relations from the University of Pennsylvania, a combination of degrees that means it is particularly appropriate that he is treasurer of the American Historical Association. Dr. McNichol has been a global head of institutional business for Fidelity International and managing director and head of the global investment managing practice of Greenwich Associates during his long career in asset management. He must do time management pretty well too, I should think. Because in addition to the book on Mayor Bloomberg, he is the author of To Be Mayor of New York, Ethnic Politics in the City, The Power of the Mayor, David Dinkins, 1990 to 1993. Those are 2 books, by the way. Thank you, Chris, for joining us, and thank you, Joe, an irreplaceable force here at Hunter. So Chris will speak, Joe will reply, they'll take your questions, and then we'll see you all in the Four Freedoms room. Please join me now in welcoming Chris McNichol.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you so much to Roosevelt House for inviting me to speak. I came by something of an indirect route. Early November, Fred Walters and I picked up a 50-foot sailing catamaran in Cape Town, South Africa. We sailed it across the Atlantic to St. Helena, to some islands off the coast of Brazil, up to Grenada and into Puerto Rico. And from there, I flew to Washington for American Historical Association meetings, and Fred shortly afterwards joined me here in New York, came here from Washington. And along the way, we discovered that we had very carelessly misplaced about 70 or 80 degrees. Friday, we'll be going back to Puerto Rico to see if we can find them again and taking up our journey. But I'm very pleased to be here at an institute that has really established itself as one of the preeminent policy institutes here in New York City. And I'm particularly pleased to be sharing a podium again with Joe Vitariti. He and I spoke not that long ago, a few weeks ago, at a CUNY Graduate Center event that was very well received. And whether Joe realized it or not at the time, he actually helped me to frame my thoughts for this evening. At the end of the evening, he said something to me that got my attention. He said that when he hears me speak about Mayor Bloomberg, it sounded to him much more positive than when he read the book and just out, sort of in his own mind, thought about what I had said. And I thought about it quite a lot, and I wasn't able to come up with a good reason why that should be the case, but he's a very knowledgeable reader, to put it mildly, and it made me think and helped me to think about how I might organize my thoughts tonight. And what I'd like to do are 4 things. One is I'm going to Bloomberg bash. He's the mayor of New York. I'm a native New Yorker. Every cab driver, every sports fan gets to do that, so I decided I can too. And I'll outline the things that I think Mayor Bloomberg and his team got wrong, significant policy failures or omissions, negligence that I think really needs to be highlighted. And then I'm going to praise the man. And he has done an enormous number of things. He and his team really worked very hard and accomplished an enormous number of things that really matter to people living in a big city like New York. And when I looked at what he accomplished, the more I dove into it and understood it, the more impressed I became. And then it fell to me to calibrate the good and the bad and the things he had done well and the things that didn't go so well and balance them somehow, to not just leave them out there as, some things worked and some didn't, but to make some judgments about his impact on the city. And when I did that, the conclusion that I came to is that, as in his own mind, he was a spectacularly successful mayor and the most successful and most influential mayor since Fiorello LaGuardia, in my judgment. And I'll explain a little bit how I came to those conclusions about the impact on the city overall and also on some of the subsegments that had very different experiences based on city policy while Michael Bloomberg was mayor. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about how I see the relationship between Mayor Bloomberg and Mayor de Blasio. What are the connections or what are the points of disconnect? How should we be thinking about these 2 men with the same job, one after the other? In what ways do they relate to each other, and what does that mean for how we govern New York? It's a lot to cover. I'm going to try very hard to do it within the time frames suggested. I see Bill Goldstein down here. He's promised to remind me of our time constraints as we go along, but I've worked very hard to organize my thoughts, so hopefully we'll be able to cover the material. So, okay, Bloomberg bashing, 5+1. There are 5 policy issues that I think he got very wrong, plus the 6th of a different caliber, or a different nature. The 5 that I think Bloomberg got wrong are stop and frisk, Rikers Island, homelessness, New York City Housing Authority, and income inequality. I'll talk a little bit about each. The sixth is his decision to run for a third term. So on stop and frisk, it's been talked about in great detail, it's been written about, and to recap briefly, a police officer who has reasonable suspicion to believe that somebody is contemplating a crime is allowed to stop that individual. If they have any reason at all to believe the individual might be armed or a threat, they can frisk that individual and ask him some questions. And it's constitutionally sanctioned, it's an acceptable police practice. In many ways, it's the fundamental police practice. And the standard example is somebody walking along a street, trying every car door on the street. Most of us, certainly I want the police officer to ask that fellow what's up. Al Sharpton says he wants the police officer to ask that fellow what's up. But under the Bloomberg team, the police took a different tack de facto, and they encouraged police officers to stop more or less every young man in areas of high crime, every young man between the ages of roughly 15 and 45 or 50, and to frisk them on a regular basis. They were trying to create an environment where anybody carrying a deadly weapon would know that they were subject to being searched at random anytime, and they wanted to create an environment that would make it too hot to carry. You can have a long debate about whether or not that's a good policy or bad policy, but it is an unconstitutional policy, and that's what a federal judge determined. And there were pernicious consequences for the city, and when you look at the numbers and dissect them carefully, when the numbers of stops and frisks were high, crime went down. When the number of stops and frisks were low, crime went down. And crime went down consistently, no matter where those numbers were. And we've seen in the successor, the de Blasio administration, they've taken those stops down to a very small number, and crime has continued to drift down. So Bloomberg and his police commissioner, Ray Kelly, claimed that this was a critical thing to keep crime low, and the numbers don't support the claim. It was a mistake. Rikers Island. We have some people very expert on this subject in the audience, so hopefully I'll get this right. But I looked at this very carefully. When Michael Bloomberg became mayor, Rikers Island was functioning about as well as a tough jail system can. There's some limitations based on the nature of the beast, but the levels of violence, the level of crime inside the prison system was well within the range of what one thinks of as acceptable or understandable in a jail system. And that was true throughout Bloomberg's first term, and actually the bad news got a little bit better, that it actually improved a little bit during his first term. Violence in the jail system spiked during his second term and spiked again in his third term. Series of reasons for it, but the jail system while Bloomberg was mayor went from acceptable to unacceptable to barbaric, and the level of violence and crime inside the jailhouses, the level of violence to which African-American prisoners, in particular young African-American adolescents and people of color were subjected to was beyond anything that a civilized city could accept. And it became very clear, there were headlines about it. I asked one of his top deputies, how could that be? Everything we know about Mr. Bloomberg is that he cares about people and he wouldn't want that to happen. One deputy told me that it just was not on the radar screen, and the deputy directly responsible had it very much on the radar screen and took a series of steps to try and respond to it that were unequal to the task and unsuccessful. And you'd have to declare the state of affairs in Rikers Island to have been awful at the end of Mr. Bloomberg's third term and unacceptable, and his successor's been forced to contend with that. Third, homelessness. And here Bloomberg gets some credit, and then ultimately it has to be said that his policies failed. When he became mayor, homelessness was at a certain sort of standard level that we've had in this city for a long time, for better or for worse, acceptable or unacceptable. But anywhere between 25 and 35,000 people were homeless on a given night in New York City. And a number of his advisors encouraged the mayor to steer clear of the issue. He said, the closer you get to it, the worse it's going to be. Stay away. And his chief of staff and the commissioner of homeless said, you can't do that. And by the way, if you try, it won't work. Eventually it will bite you. You really ought to try and do something about it. And Bloomberg, to his credit, stood up and said, okay, let's really see what we can do to solve the problem. And they got together a commission, a smart commission. They came up with a series of good recommendations. They implemented 85, 90% of them over the next couple of years. They set as their goal reducing the number of homeless in New York City by 2/3 in 5 years. And they implemented many of the programs that they had determined, and were having a little bit of success. The number of homeless individuals dropped by about 20%. the number of homeless families, number of people in homeless families began to drift down just a few percent, nowhere near what they had hoped to accomplish. And then the financial crisis hit, and then some state policies changed, and the homeless policies turned into a bad failure. And by the time Mr. Bloomberg ended his third term, there were more people living in homeless shelters in New York City, city-sponsored homeless shelters, than at any time since the Great Depression. So best of intentions, but the implementation clearly did not have the outcome, and again, his successor has been left dealing with that problem. New York City Housing Authority. Across the country, public housing has generally been considered a failure. Many large cities have gotten out of the business altogether. Famously in Chicago, they actually blew up one of the worst housing developments there, that they just decided it was so impossible to get it to work and so filled with crime and gangs and horrible things that the city had to get out of the business. New York City Housing Authority has been the bold exception to that story for its entire history. With all of its problems, it has worked way better than just about any other large public housing project in the United States. And when Bloomberg inherited it, it had its problems, but it was functioning, and the mayor and his team disinvested in it. And they left the New York City Housing Authority in the worst state of disrepair that it had been in its 78-year history. The Community Service Society examined it and declared it the worst and largest landlord in New York City. And it's a little bit extreme, but they had good cause. So that also has to be looked at as a failure. And then finally, income inequality. It became a huge issue. Many economists, particularly after the financial crisis, many economists increasingly drew attention to it. Economists had been looking at it for a long time. The public at large began to recognize just how serious an issue it was, that the levels of income were becoming increasingly concentrated, with a small number of people doing really well, and with a very large number of people being left behind. And it sort of came together and got crystallized with a proposal for a policy of a living wage. The notion that if somebody is willing to work full-time, they ought to be able to earn a wage that rises them above the federal poverty level. And in particular, if somebody is working in a project where the city had dedicated tax money, taxpayer money, public money, that the people who work in that project or the outcome of that project, they ought to be given a wage that gets them above poverty level. And that was the concept. And it had been implemented by the time this came to the head in the Bloomberg administration at Kingsbridge Armory up in the Bronx, down the block from Lehman College, where my brother went to college. It was brought to Bloomberg with a series of policies that would have allowed the armory that had been in disuse for about 20 years to be renovated, turned into a mall, a lot of businesses put there, and a lot of employment generated by it. And the people employed were meant to get living wages according to a set of proposals by a group of activists. They brought it to the deputy mayor, they brought it to the president of the Economic Development Corporation, they had a series of negotiations, and they weren't that far apart. The deputy mayor brought it to Mayor Bloomberg and said, we can really get this done. And Mayor Bloomberg said, these are communists. And a normally pragmatic mayor, a mayor who really knew how to cut a deal and get things done, somehow had a switch flipped. And to him, this was a bright red line. It was too close in his mind to central planning, to government planning, and government setting of wages in ways that he thought was a violation of market economics, and he wouldn't do it. Much to the surprise of his deputy, much to the surprise of his president of economic development, who'd worked with him very closely and pragmatically on any number of issues. And I struggled very hard to understand it, and the best I could do was one of his deputies told me off the record, if I recall accurately, he said, look, Chris, you have to understand, by definition, billionaires don't worry about concentration of wealth. It's just not an issue. And perhaps that's the answer. So those are 5 policy areas, significant policy areas in my judgment, that had a real impact on large numbers of people, where the Bloomberg team got it wrong, and the policies either were unsuccessful with real consequences, or there was negligence or omissions of a kind that you'd have to really say that wasn't great. And then there's a 6th one, 5+1. The one has to do with his decision to run for a 3rd term. And here I think the easiest way to share my thoughts on is to read just a couple of sentences from the book. My publisher tells me I should hold it up when I say that. Speaking about Michael Bloomberg's decision to run for a third term, he, Michael Bloomberg, exercised the power of, when he, Michael Bloomberg, flexed his political muscles to secure the right to run for a third term, something that the city forbade on the basis of 2 citywide referenda passed with ample majorities, he disrespected the will of the people he represented. He ignored the objections of his 3 closest advisors to take an action he himself called disgraceful and outrageous until he decided to do it. His contention that the maneuver did not violate democratic principles because voters still had to re-elect him is disingenuous sophistry offered by a powerful incumbent who proceeded to outspend his rival by 6 times in campaign funds and another 6 times in philanthropic largesse. So 5 plus 1, the first 5 all have a common thread. They had disproportionate impact on poor people of color, and then the decision to run for a third term. People who don't scuba dive often ask people who do scuba dive, in the waters where you dive, are there sharks, and do you worry about them? Are they dangerous? And the answer is there's probably 400 species of sharks, and there's really only 5, and they're in all waters, and there's really only 5 you have to worry about: great whites, bull, tiger, hammerhead, and Atlantic whitetip. And then there's another couple of hundred. And to me, these 5, those are Bloomberg's top 5 sharks. And if you're so disposed, you can find a lot of other things that went wrong over a 12-year period in a city as complex as New York. And some are quite entertaining and some are confusing. But to me, those are the ones that really matter and had an impact on people's lives. And then the 6th, his decision to run for a third term, which in my mind was really a severe violation of democratic principle. That's the bashing. Okay? Now let me praise the man, and there's a lot to praise. When I think about the mayor's job, I think of 3 essential tasks, 3 non-negotiable tasks that a mayor must fulfill: fiscal solvency, public safety, and public education. If you don't get those right, the interest groups of the city won't let you govern, is what it comes down to, and I can give some examples of that. Fiscal solvency, I think in this city we proved that if you get that wrong, it really has an impact for a very long period of time. Between the mid-1970s and early 1990s, we lost a quarter to a third of our police, a quarter to a third of our school teachers. Trucks very literally fell through the West Side Highway, and we had a transit system that was awful beyond belief. There's been a lot of talk about how we really need to improve the transit system, all of which is true. But only if you think with nostalgia can you believe that this situation is anything comparable to how bad it was back in the early 80s, late 1970s, early 80s, when the transit system was a mess. So without fiscal solvency, pretty much the city heads in a very bad direction. Bloomberg managed this city through 2 fiscal crises, the one immediately after 9/11 and after the financial crisis, 2008-2009, with extraordinary skill. The impact on the city was about as limited as one could have hoped, given the circumstances. He had the courage to raise taxes, including surcharges on income taxes, surcharges on sales taxes, and the ability to back off that when circumstances got better, he allowed those surcharges to expire and didn't spend money just because he could. He managed the capital budget with terrific skill. He invested $123 billion in really necessary infrastructure in the city, raised bonds or issued bonds in order to raise the money, and left the city treasury better off than when he found it. If you look at debt service ratios, if you look at bond ratings, if you look at a number of characteristics that people look at to think about the financial health of a city, it improved. And I'll come back and talk about his very courageous decision to raise real estate taxes, because it is a demonstration beyond just the need for fiscal health. It is a very different proposition in my mind of how Michael Bloomberg governed the city with respect to economic development than some of his predecessors. I'll talk about that again. I'm going to stop there and move on to public safety because I am a finance guy, and I've discovered that my willingness and interest in talking about city budget issues far exceeds the desire of any audience I've ever been in front of to listen to it. But if there are people that would like to talk more about his budget management, very happy to do so. Public safety. Mayor Bloomberg and Commissioner Kelly have an extraordinary record. Major crime in New York City dropped 30%. I'm talking about the FBI's index of 7 major crimes. It dropped 30% over the 12 years that Michael Bloomberg was mayor and Ray Kelly was police commissioner. At the same time, the number of police officers in New York City dropped by 5,000. And at the same time, the number of New Yorkers incarcerated in federal, state, or city prisons dropped by 20,000. Over a third, at a time when the number of Americans incarcerated around the country was drifting up. dramatic or significant decrease in crime with fewer police officers, with fewer people put in jail. It's an extraordinary record. And while that was going on, they created a counterintelligence or a terrorist counterintelligence and operational capability that, as best can be told, second to none of any municipality around the world. And just think of the audacity of the decision. A city government, a municipality, deciding that because of two events, 9/11 obviously, but most people remember in 1993 there was a bomb put in the World Trade Tower. This was round two. And reasonable people concluded that New York City could not rely on the federal government to protect it from global terrorism, and we'd have to do it ourselves. That's an audacious decision. I can imagine a lot of mayors under different circumstances saying, we can't possibly do it, we don't have the resources, we can't have some kind of global capability, we have to figure out how to get the federal government to do it. But no, when Ray Kelly brought that recommendation to Bloomberg, it was not fully developed yet. He just said, we have to do it, and the starting point is to create a couple of positions and get the right people in here. And if you think about it, what Kelly was saying New York City had to do was to find a way to get important information from around the world, real time, brought back to desks in New York City in a central location so people making important decisions could do it on the basis of accurate real-time information. That's the business Michael Bloomberg created in the financial services industry. Right. And it was a very short conversation. Bloomberg knew it was possible. He knew it could be done. He and Ray Kelly decided it had to be done. And over the next 12 years, there was not a successful terrorist attack in New York City. There were at least 16 efforts, as best we know. 16 efforts that Ray Kelly called efforts to commit mass murder in New York City, and not a one of them succeeded. So less crime, fewer police officers, significantly fewer people in prison, having assumed a responsibility that of rights belongs to the federal government but was brought into New York City. It's an extraordinary record. Stop and frisk is a stain on it, an unmistakable and undeniable stain in my judgment, but on balance, it's an extraordinary record. Public education, far more complicated and nuanced, but a couple of points to make. First and foremost is that Michael Bloomberg reestablished managerial integrity to a system that had lost it. The old school board system, 7 board members appointed by 6 different political elected officials, all but ensured incoherence, in conjunction with 32 elected school boards from around the city, most of which were failures most of the time. And just to put a point to it, there was a moment in time when Ed Koch was mayor, when out of the 32 school boards, 11 were under criminal investigation. Never mind a discussion of how effective they were and were they accomplishing good things. And in certain neighborhoods, they worked reasonably well, but I think it's fair to say that roughly 2/3 of the school boards around the city at any moment in time were failing. The Central Board of Education was unmanageable, and Bloomberg was able to secure control of the school system for the mayor. It was a moment in time when the time was ripe for it, but his deputies, Mark Shaw, who's with us tonight, Dennis Walcott, they put together a plan. They went to Albany, they negotiated. Bloomberg played a very forceful role. They got it done. Randy Weingarten said to me that the time was right. She was ready to move in that direction because of the politics. But she also said nobody was giving Rudy Giuliani control of the schools. When Bloomberg came in, that was what made the difference. And so now we have mayoral control, we have a managerial coherence without which improvements in the school system I don't think would be particularly possible. And then you get into, was the school system better off or worse off at the end of Bloomberg's 12 years? And how about charter schools, and how about the small school program, and how did those work out? I spent a lot of time working through that data and that information. The MDRC has thousands of pages of analysis that they did on it with tables and charts and graphs. NYU had some very substantial studies. And the federal government has a set of exams that go on periodically, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, which are the most well-respected standardized exams in comparison to state exams, which had all kinds of challenges to them. The conclusion is that the school system was better off at the end of the Bloomberg team, the Bloomberg chancellor regime, than at the beginning. The scores were measurably better, not dramatically so, nowhere near as much better as one would have liked, considering the degree of investment, the time, the effort that had been put into it. If you wanted to be uncharitable, you could make the case that Bloomberg inherited a challenged or failing school system. When he left, it still was, but it was better off than when he had inherited it, measurably, and there was managerial integrity that allowed this mayor to continue to make improvements in it. I know that there are quite a few people who don't like the charter school movement, a lot of people that don't like the small school movement. They have very strong views. When you look at the numbers about New York City during that 12-year period, it does appear that unequivocally, those programs left students better off than the programs that they replaced, with all of the failures that went along with many elements of that program. So on those three essential tasks, I give Bloomberg very high to reasonably good scores. And then you get to his economic development programs and his environmental programs, which I think are best looked at in conjunction with each other. First and foremost, Michael Bloomberg declared that economic development and a healthy environment are not mutually exclusive or priorities that oppose each other. He said we can have both, we have to have both, and he implemented both. His economic program, in my judgment, was very different than his predecessors. What Michael Bloomberg understood, first of all, he was a businessman, an extraordinarily successful businessman and entrepreneur. He understood the local economy to a degree that his predecessors did not. And he and his team understood that New York City is a high-cost place of doing business and was going to remain so. And reducing taxes was not going to change that reality in too meaningful a way. And if you were to reduce taxes, then you would reduce city services and make the city less and less desirable place to live. So he and his team decided that the right approach was to follow a set of policies that would bring businesses that could operate successfully in a high-cost environment into New York City, right? High profit margin businesses. And those tend to be businesses that hire large numbers of highly educated individuals who need to work together with other individuals in highly creative industries. They have to rely on each other at a high level of capability. It's what urban theorists call agglomerations. It's not a very elegant word, but we live in a city that when we talk about city planning, we use the term ULURP, so we can't complain too much about terms that are not so elegant. So they set out to make sure that New York City would be an attractive place for people to come and open up businesses. In the financial services industry, had long been the case, in technology, in fashion, in media. They identified education not just as an important service, but as an industry to be supported. Hospitals, things that had been going on in New York City for a long time. These are not new industries for New York, but these are industries that prosper in a certain environment with certain conditions. And they set out to make sure that all of those conditions were as beneficial as they could be for businesses of that kind. They didn't want to pick winners and losers, but they wanted to create an environment that would be highly beneficial for high profit margin businesses, and also tourism, which has some different characteristics, but is certainly something that the city benefits from and focuses on. So they did that, and they followed a series of policies that were smart and effective to accomplish that. And simultaneously, they worked very hard to improve the environment. Bloomberg, somewhere along the way, decided that public health and environmental issues overlap so much that in his mind, they're more or less the same thing. And the number of initiatives that were pursued successfully is dramatic. We all know that we had a smoking ban in New York City that generated an enormous amount of resistance at first, and now people are thrilled with it. And there were a series of concerns at the time that turned out not to be warranted. And Bloomberg stared him down, and he got it passed, and the city's been better for it. There's an estimate that the health department has performed that you can't really audit, you can't really prove it, but they claim that probably that decision saved 50,000 New Yorkers' lives. And if you think about it, it's about 18 times the number of people who lost their lives on 9/11. It's a dramatic impact, and it sparked recognition around the country and around the world of a latent desire to see this kind of a policy implemented. And in places near and far, and now as far afield as Uruguay and Turkey, there are programs that seek to emulate this. One of Bloomberg's deputies said to me that when the people came over from Ireland to talk about banning smoking, that's when they knew that they had figured something out. And on the health front, I'm not going to belabor the point. There are lots of programs. Bloomberg invested in the Health and Hospital Corporation. He's a big believer in public health. The head of Johns Hopkins Public Health Institute at one point pitched Bloomberg in business terms. He said, Mike, doctors save lives one at a time. Public health saves them wholesale. And Bloomberg bought the act, and now, of course, Johns Hopkins is their public policy, their public health program is named after Bloomberg, who's then donated enormous amounts of money to it. And he applied those ideas here in New York City in very far-ranging ways. And I want to come back to the 18.5% tax raise. So Bloomberg, as his second year was arriving and he was preparing his budget, there was a huge crisis in terms of the budget gap. And his deputy mayor suggested that they raise property taxes 25%, cut a deal with the city council where the mayor would propose 25%, they would make it 20%, they'd take credit for saving everybody 5%. And then when push came to shove, the council delivered 18.5%, pretty close. Well, Michael Bloomberg raised real estate taxes 18.5%. So that's already really different than the way we think of economic development with his recent predecessors, Mayor Koch, Mayor Dinkins, Mayor Giuliani, who generally were thought of as promoting what are called the FIRE industries, financial services, insurance, and real estate. And by giving real estate firms benefits, they would develop the city. They, in turn, would then make donations to those mayors. And there was a very cozy and unfortunate set of circumstances, certainly by appearance. But that was the economic development policy, give tax cuts and give breaks to people in those three industries, and that was it. Bloomberg was a cheerleader for the financial services industry. They happened to be his clients at Bloomberg LP. They happened to be important for the city of New York. That was very convenient. But he was very tough on the real estate industry. And I've seen some statistics that people have presented. The numbers are accurate. I think they're misunderstood. In the years immediately after 9/11, a very large number of New York companies had reductions in their real estate taxes. The reason is because the value of real estate in New York plummeted after 9/11. In downtown Manhattan, they dropped by about 25%, and there was a knock-on effect around the city. There was a national recession, which was more severe by far for a short period in New York City because of 9/11. And so the real estate values declined, and people petitioned for a lower tax as a consequence. But the flip side to it is Bloomberg raised their taxes, 18.5%, the tax rate. And then he and his team very cleverly found a way to give that money back to small homeowners with a rebate. The rebate came just as Mayor Bloomberg was beginning to think about his reelection. About $250 million went out to 600,000 small homeowners with Mayor Bloomberg's name in 4 different places. And a number of people pointed out that that wasn't really the right way to do it, and the Bloomberg team sort of sheepishly acknowledged that, so that the next year, in October of 2005, just a few weeks before the 2005 reelection, all those checks went out, signed by the city finance commissioner, but every advertisement said, by the way, Mayor Bloomberg gave you back your taxes. So, and just to make a point as well, people say Michael Bloomberg was not a politician, and in some ways that's true, or I understand why people say that. Mayor of New York is always a political position, and I have to tell you, as a man who understood how to use the power of incumbency when he needed to, he was as shrewd as the toughest Tammany boss. And he also happened to have billions of dollars of philanthropic largesse that he could distribute as well. Okay, so you've got the good news, and you've got the bad news, and now you have to somehow equate them, calibrate them. On balance, were people better off, worse off when Michael Bloomberg was mayor? So for everybody who's in the top half of the economic strata in New York City, I think it's a pretty unequivocal case that with his fiscal policies, public safety, public education, his economic development programs, his environmental programs, it was a much happier place to be when Michael Bloomberg was mayor than before he was. Very, very successful set of programs. And then you ask yourself, what about poor people of color? Of those 5 sharks that I described, all 5 had disproportionate impact on poor people of color, right? Stop and frisk, Rikers Island, homelessness, NYCHA, and income inequality. So Bloomberg had a mixed record on poverty, complex and interesting. He invested hundreds of millions of his own money and billions of dollars of city money in efforts to try and improve the development of human capital. That if you wanted to work and you were prepared to apply yourself to get some training, or if you were a person that wanted to get back to the workforce and you needed help with childcare, or there were medical issues that you couldn't afford yourself, but you needed some place to help you get healthy so that you could get back into the workforce. The Bloomberg team had a series of policies that were very focused, very rich, not as successful as one would have wanted, but very meaningful at the margins. One of them, since we're here at a City University site, City University sponsored event, it's worth acknowledging that the accelerated, the ASAP program, right? Accelerated Studies of Associate Program, enormously successful for community college students who were trying to take advantage of City University, those who were not able to get into four-year schools, at least right out of high school, and needed help. Enormously successful program that was pursued by the Bloomberg team, initiated by the Bloomberg team, and has grown since. So if you had an opportunity to get into the workforce, they helped you a lot. If you were what might be called the dysfunctional poor and you just needed help, if you were the sort of patient that you needed pain relief, Bloomberg was not the guy. He didn't have the empathy that goes along with that to recognize that there are times that the best society and the best science has to offer is to alleviate the pain and misery of a set of circumstances, and that's a humane thing to do, and that was not Bloomberg's strength. But when you look at poor people of color, I ask myself, were they better off or worse off under Bloomberg than under Rudy Giuliani, David Dinkins, or Ed Koch? And by any number of measures, they were better off. The one that Bloomberg liked that sort of summarizes it all is that the average lifespan of a poor New Yorker improved quite significantly, to the point that a poor New Yorker lives on average now 5 years longer than a poor person in Detroit. It's a stunning statistic. And if you look at the conditions of a poor person in New York versus poor people in other cities, the 20 largest cities around the United States, roughly the same time that Bloomberg governed, they were better off at the end of Bloomberg's term than at the beginning. When Bloomberg became mayor, New York had the 5th highest proportion of poor people, and when Bloomberg left, it had the 13th highest proportion of poor people in comparison to the other large cities around the country. Clear improvement. Their own estimates, the Bloomberg team estimated that roughly 200,000 people who would have degenerated into poverty had they been left to their own devices were able to rise out of poverty based on their programs. Tough to audit, plausible based on all the statistics that I looked at. So the top half of the city did better, and the bottom half, as best I can tell, even with those very severe policy failures, they also were better off during Mayor Bloomberg's term than before. Let me just finish with a reflection on Mayor de Blasio and Mayor Bloomberg and the relationship between the two. Mayor de Blasio was often presented as the remedy or the antidote to Mayor Bloomberg. Mayor Bloomberg was the data-driven, heartless, soulless technocrat who governed by the numbers, and Mayor de Blasio is the warm-hearted, soulful, humane mayor who cares about the poor people of the city and wants to make sure that the vulnerable get the resources they need from city government. My own view is that Mayor de Blasio's success is in no small measure dependent on Mayor Bloomberg's success. That Mayor de Blasio inherited a strong economy, which made budget management easy. He inherited a safe city and a strong police force, and he inherited a school system that you could manage and that you could actually direct and help make improvements. I think of Mayor de Blasio as what Mayor Dinkins looks like when the city is functioning. Philosophically, those two mayors had a lot in common. Mayor Dinkins inherited a rolling budget crisis, a untenable level of crime and very serious issues in the police force, if you think back to the Mullen Commission, and a school board that was probably unmanageable. Certainly he was not able to manage it, and he had a lot of trouble as a consequence of that. He lost the chancellor he thought best qualified to lead the school system because of his inability to manage that board. And the reaction to those gaps, to his inability to manage through those really challenging circumstances, made it very difficult to him to govern. Tabloids with headlines, "Dave, do something." The governor threatening to exercise the power of the Emergency Financial Control Board and remove budget management from the city, and all of the sturm and angst that went along with that. Headlines that having to do with the culture wars around the school system made it very difficult for David Dinkins to govern. So I think of Bill de Blasio as in some ways being a logical successor to Mayor Bloomberg rather than an antidote or a remedy. And to me, the key issue is not, are we going to have a mayor that follows Bloomberg's technocratic approach or Mayor de Blasio's more humane approach, to use those terms, sort of my caricature. I think the real key is to figure out how do we keep both of those threads on track? How do we make sure that we continue to attract to New York City highly capable, hardworking, affluent, taxpayer-generating people? And how do we make sure that we continue to provide the kinds of services that a humane society provides to the most vulnerable people in the city? We need to keep both on track. If you do only one or only the other, it has a set of consequences that leaves a city less strong than we would like the city to be. So, and I hope that's a good segue into Joe's talk.
Hi. Um, First, let me say that I've been following Chris's work for a long time. He's really one of the premier historians of New York. I've read all three of his books carefully, and I think this may be the best. It's balanced, it's thoroughly researched, it's well documented, it's well written. And it deals with a very important period in the history of New York City, based on a lot of prior study of the roles of mayors in New York, which is an interest of mine, obviously. We have somewhat different perspectives on this, not because I disagree with a lot of what he says, but maybe in terms of emphases. Maybe it's because I'm a political scientist and he's a historian, although you're a historian that likes politics and I'm a political scientist who likes history, so I guess that's why we connect. So let me start with the question, how do you assess a mayor of New York? And I think you can't answer that question unless you first answer the question of what is the mayor trying to achieve? And that there's a larger question there, what is New York City trying to achieve? What is New York about? So in my book, I spent a lot of time talking about the soul of New York, going back to LaGuardia. And I describe New York, and it's not original, as the gateway to the American dream. I think other people have said that before. I think a lot of us in the room have been the product of that dream. Certainly a lot of people who attend Hunter College and the City University of New York do. New York has a historic purpose. And if it has a soul, I'm going to use a word that some people will like and some won't. It's a progressive soul. And what do we mean by that? Well, it means that New York is a place of opportunity. It's a place that converts and has for generations and centuries immigrants into citizens who have some power over their own destiny. New York is a place that takes care of people who are vulnerable. That to me is the soul of New York. Maybe that's my take on it, but that's what it is. That progress has been a very long journey. It was Tammany who led to the incorporation of the Irish. LaGuardia helped incorporate the Italians and the Jews. LaGuardia really gave the city a sense of its soul because working with the federal government and the gentleman who lived in this building at one time, put lots of government resources in to help people in need during the Great Depression. So if you want to, it's interesting to me that most New York City mayors in our lifetime, if you asked them who their hero was, they'll turn to LaGuardia. I have a little bit of trouble reconciling LaGuardia's legacy with Bloomberg's legacy because I don't think they had the same priorities. Wagner helped incorporate organized labor. It was John Lindsay who really moved against great odds to incorporate blacks and Latinos, and he was the first one really at a time when nobody else was doing it to speak out on behalf of women and gays. So it's been a long journey, and it's been a very irregular journey with a lot of fits and starts. And at one point, the journey became interrupted. And that was a factor that was caused by many things. One was a divestment of the federal government and the kinds of programs that would help government have a more positive impact on people who lived in places like New York and other cities. And the other was the city's own fiscal limitations, which in 1975 dramatically was highlighted in the New York City fiscal crisis, where we couldn't pay our bills anymore. We were spending more money than we had. And we can look back on it. I mean, there were lots of other things that went on during that time that we could talk about, and I talk about in the book, but that was a turning point. So Bloomberg comes along, and one has to say he presided over one of the most miraculous recoveries in the history of the city, financially. He not only comes in right after 9/11, which devastated downtown, he comes in with a over $3 billion budget deficit. And one cannot deny, as Chris said, that the movement, the economic development of the city during his tenure was remarkable. We can go on and on. His better use, reinvigorating the waterfront. He made New York a greener city. He implemented some very significant health laws that had an impact. But the recovery was very uneven. By the time Bloomberg leaves, 20% of the city is living in poverty, 20% of the population, and 47% are near poverty, all at a time when the city has experienced one of its most miraculous financial recoveries in history. I don't blame that all on Bloomberg. That inequality that Chris talked about is very much a function of global economics. I think it's very much a function, as I discuss in the book, of federal policy, particularly in the areas of taxation and regulation. But the question is, what can a mayor do to deal with the effects of that larger economy? And here's a place where I don't think Bloomberg intentionally showed up. As Chris mentioned, he rejected a living wage law. He rejected the idea of a higher tax on hedge fund managers. He rejected also a paid sick leave law, which to me was remarkable for a guy who was so much interested in health. I don't know if it's great to post, what the dietary details of McDonald's hamburgers, but if people are showing up sick at work when they're handling the food, it's not actually a great thing. So these are the kinds of things where I think he just had a sensitivity which, to me, undermine what I believe is what New York is truly all about. I'm sure he would disagree with me, and he was the mayor, so he had a lot more to say than this than I do. I just write books and talk about it, which is much easier than running the city. There are other policy areas that Chris got into which we can mention. We can argue over how praiseworthy the reduction of crime was in light of the abuse of stop, question, and frisk, which was deemed unconstitutional by a federal court. And on his way out the door, he was thinking of challenging that decision. We can go back and forth on that. He had a remarkable housing plan, but many of it didn't reach people who were the poorest and most in need. Education is an area that I've spent a lot of time on. And I headed up a commission on mayoral control during the Bloomberg years, and actually was research director for a charter commission during that period also. I'm a big believer in mayoral. I think one of the most important things that Bloomberg did was he kind of dismantled an education system that wasn't functioning. And I was one of the first supporters of mayoral control. When I wrote a book in 1983, after I had served as special assistant to the chancellor, I said the mayor should control the schools, and everybody thought I was crazy. They probably still do for other reasons. And in 2001, when this was an issue, the New York Times asked me to write an op-ed about it, and I wrote an op-ed arguing the case for mayoral control too. So I think that Bloomberg and Klein were very effective at dismantling a system that wasn't working. School boards were a disaster, as you said. When those 11 community boards that were under investigation, I was working in the chancellor's office at that time. And so there's no doubt about it. Where he went wrong is, I think, as those of us who argued for mayoral control for many years, I thought it was a lost opportunity when he brought in a schools chancellor who knew nothing about education to run the schools after that. and people have strong views about Joel. I think the dismantling of the mistake was important, but what they built in return wasn't that spectacular. I agreed with charter schools. I think I'm a long-term advocate of charter schools also. And I think that was probably one of his great contributions. I agree with small schools. But when you kind of look at the bottom line at the end, you can't look at the state test scores because they kept changing the way they were measuring tests, and so you can't look at it longitudinally and compare it from year to year. But if you look at the NAEP scores, which is a national report card in New York from 2002 to 2013, eighth grade reading scores improved 4 points in 12 years. Eighth grade math scores improved 8 points in 12 years. That's not spectacular. The lower grades did better, but if you lose the ground you gain by the eighth grade, the lower grades don't count in that sense. And as I said before, I think it was a lost opportunity because if you look at Michael Bloomberg institutionally, he was the most powerful mayor in the history of the city because, as Chris and I have talked about this, I've written a lot about governance in New York. By the time he became mayor, there was no board of estimate to deal with anymore that was challenging the mayor's power, and now he was in charge of the school system. But this faith he had in managers who were, quote, managers, kind of reached a point of absurdity with the appointment of Kathy Black, who I think lasted for 6 weeks. So we can talk more about education, but I know we're going to run out of time soon. Let me tell you, though, my major problem with the Bloomberg years were, and that is what I think the devastating effect that he had on the democratic process in New York. Both from a political point of view and from a governing point of view. And that was all about what I would call the misuse of a personal fortune to have such an effect on the political process in New York that it should have been almost intolerable. I mean, campaign finance laws, unfortunately, we have probably the best in the country, but it's not good enough. And the Supreme Court has handed down decisions recently that doesn't really allow you to do very much when it comes to campaign finance reform. And so there's a big hole in the system, and he took advantage of it more than anybody I've ever seen in history. And nobody else could afford to do that the way he did. But, just to throw some numbers around, when he ran in 2001, he spent 4 times what his opponent spent. When he ran in 2005, he spent 8 times what his opponent spent. And when he ran in 2009, he spent 10 times what his opponent spent. Over $110 million for a local campaign, and he won by less than 80,000 votes. So I have to believe that campaign spending had something to do with that. And so as a political scientist who has spent a lot of time writing about governance and thinking about governance, I find that problematic. The other place where there was a distortion is the way personal wealth was used in governing itself. Generosity is good to a point, but as I said in the book, sometimes it's not any better to give than to receive. When he served as mayor, his first deputy mayor simultaneously served as CEO of his philanthropy. So she was giving out money while they were serving, she was serving in City Hall. I don't know how the Conflict of Interest Board approved that, but they did. But if that's not a conflict of interest, then I don't know what is. You know, we here who make not as much as some people, we fill out all kinds of forms because we're state employees. And when you see something like that happen, you say, wow, what the hell is going on here? But anyway, these are the kinds of things that I think need to be talked about more, particularly in an age when money has become to play a disproportionate role in politics. There was lots of talks about reform when there was thoughts about a constitutional convention, and there are a lot of people who are for and against that. But that conversation has not really caught on in Albany for some reason. I can't imagine why. But these are the kinds of things that I think we have to remember. I think Mike Bloomberg himself said that he thought New York City was a luxury item. I think he really believed it. Luxury items are items that very few people can afford. If he didn't believe it, then I'd have to say he didn't do a whole lot purposely to change that. I don't think it was part of his priority. I don't think it was something he thought about much. And for that reason, I find it, I think he was kind of out of touch with what I believe is a basic ethos of New York City that gives me pause when people remember mostly the good things and not too many of the things that need attention. I think Chris has done a wonderful job giving a balanced look at the Bloomberg years. I probably myself spend a little more time thinking about the political system. As I said, I'm a political scientist, so maybe that's it's in my blood. But anyway, I'm not going to get into de Blasio because I have too much to say in too short a period of time. And so, and I think we want to open this up for Q&A. If anybody has questions about de Blasio, I'm happy to answer them. I think, we may have a few books here that if anybody's interested, I'm happy to I didn't bring one to show you, but they're out there, I think. And I think we should get on with the Q&A.
So I will choose the questioners. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Chris. We'll take your questions, yes? And please wait for the microphone. We have two people coming around with the microphone.
I have to admit, I've never been a fan of the New York City Housing Authority from the time I was Lindsay's housing commissioner to date. I have lots of experience. But in one way, you are treating them very unfairly, and it may come as a surprise. I have worked in Chicago for the Housing Authority as an alternate manager. I've been a developer in Detroit, Philadelphia, Chester. All of these places were able to take advantage of the Hope 6 program to demolish what was functionally obsolete with federal money and to rebuild generally low-rise, better design, high quality, and mixed income. The problem with the New York City Housing Authority is it was the only one in the country that built the building so good that they couldn't meet the test of functionally obsolete. So in that sense, we'll have to leave them off the hook.
I'm not sure that there was a question there, but anyway, moving on. Questions? Oh, in the back. Oh, right next to, yes, thank you.
You know what, can I just say one thing?
Okay.
Just to say something about New York. One of the reasons it was preserved also is because New York was one of the few cities in the country that did not dismantle public housing. And even during the period when Chicago and other cities were taking down public housing because federal money evaporated, Ed Koch, who's not seen as a liberal, we were doing public housing or housing programs like it was going out of style. I mean, Koch's housing program was extraordinary. To me, it goes back to the issue of what your priorities are. And New York's priorities have been, I thought, in the right place when it comes to that.
Mayor Bloomberg is often mentioned as a third-party presidential candidate. Do you think he'll run in 2020?
In the interest of time, no. But to elaborate a little bit, he contemplated twice, 2008, 2016. They did a lot of research. They created a shadow campaign team, and their assessment, and I suspect it was accurate, their assessment was that Bloomberg is too associated with Wall Street to win the Democratic nomination, and he's too associated with liberal issues on cultural matters, gun control and gay rights and things like that to win the Republican nomination. And as a consequence, he'd have to run as an independent. The best that his team thinks he could have done was to win enough Electoral College votes to throw the decision into the House of Representatives, who would surely pick the candidate of their party, with one certain outcome, that whoever became president would have a badly diminished mandate. And the likelihood in the current environment is it would be a Republican candidate, and Bloomberg did not want to be the spoiler that created that. And in 2020, he'll be 79 years old, having sort of contemplated twice to run and decided both times that it wasn't likely to lead to success. I'd be very surprised if he chooses to run. I also think he would have been an excellent president. Joe mentions Ed Koch. Before we're done, I'm going to tell one fun Ed Koch story, just one.
Oh, is there an Ed Koch story?
Thank you.
Okay.
The question is to both of you. Do you think that New York might be a little too big for any single person to move substantially in the right direction? When I think of Mr. Bloomberg, I think of the cessation of smoking in public places, the lives saved because of that. I think of incredible beautification, civilization, and race relations, and well, not perfect, but things were peaceful. There was I have positive impressions, and I'm impressed with that. Now, I don't want to, my personal opinion of Mr. de Blasio doesn't matter.
Okay.
He emphasizes something else, and it's much more narrowly focused to my mind. Both of them raise this question: is New York too big to be cohesively managed as a unit, just like is the United States too big to be managed as a unit?
I'm not sure we have much of a choice. It's not really supposed to be run by only one person. The thing is, we elect people who believe that it's their job to run the city, but there's a city council, there are other bodies, decision-making bodies. I think it's attracted a lot of purposeful people. One of the things about doing this book that was helpful to me is I worked my way through, from LaGuardia to Wagner, Lindsay, to Giuliani, Koch, who I worked for, Koch. They all, if you see them in the context of their time, made a difference. Not always to the, in a way that that satisfied everybody, but we do tend to elect remarkable people, I guess the same big city produces that kind of person, so is it too big? It's big.
Comment that surely it's a difficult city to manage. Surely anybody who thinks they can manage it is a person who has to have a very strong, large ego. Which brings me to a story about Ed Koch. When my first book came out, he invited himself to my house for dinner, which I found astonishing. And what Bobby Wagner explained to me is that this man, who was so powerful and so influential for so long, had a funny kind of insecurity, and he didn't feel that he had been accepted until somebody that, for whatever reason he valued, had invited him to their home. And the first time I thought it was crazy. I thought he was being polite. But he asked 3 times. And I talked to him. He said, invite him. So he comes and he brings a videotape. Said, I was on television earlier today, and this is the tape of it. And if we run out of things to talk about, maybe we can look at it. 45 seconds later, in his mind, we had run out of things to talk about, and we watched the tape. But he thought he could run New York City, and honestly, I think we've had some very capable mayors, and I think we benefit when you have somebody who has clarity of purpose, clarity of vision, and is able to both exercise authority and delegate authority and has the right. I think the city is as governable as any large city of this kind, and I think we do pretty well.
We have time for one more question now that we've had the Ed Koch story. I was going to leave time for one more question so we could hear it in the back.
Chris, this question is for you. You called the mayor running for a 3rd term to be undemocratic, yet we're sitting in a house where a president ran for 4 terms. So could you sort of describe, in contrast, were they both being undemocratic?
So when Franklin Roosevelt ran, there were no rules against it. There was no law against it. There had not been any national referendum that said we want a president to have only 2 terms. There's a tradition that George Washington established that's very important and very admirable. But in my mind, that wasn't Franklin Roosevelt breaking the rules and asserting his authority in a way that was anti-democratic. When he tried to pack the Supreme Court, you could make the case that it was that. But just to pick up on a point, I agree wholeheartedly with Joe that the real issue in politics these days is the way that we have legalized bribery, which is what we've done. It's clearly a corrupt system, and any of the central players in it are corrupt one way or the other. What was remarkable about Mayor Bloomberg is that he didn't have to cater to real estate interests and financial interests in those people because he could finance his own campaign. But historian Fred Siegel, am I allowed to invoke the name of the former director of the Manhattan Institute in this institute? But he's a historian, and I think he captured it perfectly when he said what Mayor Bloomberg did was he reversed the direction of the conflict. And instead of the mayor taking money from powerful corporate interests and then doing their bidding, Bloomberg was so wealthy that he could use it to buy political influence or to silence potential opponents who wanted his financial largesse. So I think we need to rewrite the finance rules. A Supreme Court that decides that money and speech are the same thing is extraordinary in my mind. You ask any 10-year-old, is money and speech the same thing? They'll tell you no, right? So I look forward to the day when some meaningful candidates will unilaterally disarm. They'll declare they're running for high political office, maximum political contribution of pick your number, $1,000 or something like that, versus right now, at the governor level, you can give a check for $66,000, and that's perfectly legal, and that's before you play games. So I think that we need to address that. That, to me, is the real threat to democracy right now in New York City, New York State.
Just to respond, I don't think that it's a fair comparison. I don't think it's a fair comparison, Bloomberg and FDR. When Bloomberg ran for a 3rd term, he managed to persuade the city council in its wisdom to allow it to happen after there were 2 popular referendums saying that he should be term limited, 2 terms. One of the things I forgot to mention earlier, that was one of the instances where there were reports in the press that people who had been beneficiaries of his largesse were being asked to testify before the city council to tell the council what a great idea they thought a 3rd term would be. That's the sort of thing that muddies the water a lot in politics, and that was not what happened with FDR, who ran. It was legal at that point, and we've had term limits since then.
Well, thank you very much, Joe and Chris. And please come upstairs for a reception and a book signing by both authors, and thank you very much for being here.